Goodness, I'm not even ready. Sorry about this, guys. My computer's just acting a little slow here. That's where we need to get. We're picking up with the second part of Chapter 13 on the respiratory tract. And with Part 1, we basically got through the ins and outs, so to speak, of basic lung capacities as well as basic lung anatomy. And now we're going to start to talk about how that actual gas exchange occurs across the lung surface and the mechanics behind that. It does involve a little bit of physics. So let's start with a discussion about solubility. Solubility, you may recall, we talked about this in Chapter 2, I believe. This is the ability of a substance to dissolve in a liquid. Solubility of gases is going to determine whether or not that particular gas stays in a solution, such as the blood, rather than the partial pressure of the gases. We tend to think of solubility as something that has to do with a solid dissolving in a liquid, but gases can dissolve in a liquid as well. Think about when you pop the top on a soda can, all of those bubbles that are coming out are the carbon dioxide bubbles that had been dissolved in that soda. So there is a certain amount of control that has to go on when we talk about respiratory gas concentration. The rate and the depth of breathing, which is determined by pulmonary ventilation, are going to control the partial pressure of oxygen as well as carbon dioxide in the alveoli themselves. The partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood is going to be controlled by the metabolic rate of the tissue cells. So let's talk about what goes on in the pulmonary capillaries. This is where it gets a little bit complicated. Again, we're just trying to focus on the big picture here. Partial pressure of oxygen is actually lower in the blood than in the air when it's entering the pulmonary capillaries. This should make sense because we're talking about bringing air that's relatively high in oxygen concentration into the lungs, and that's going to diffuse into that deoxygenated blood that is coming from the right ventricle, which has come from the systemic circuit. So in other words, that low oxygen blood is coming to the lungs, to those pulmonary capillaries. It has a lower partial pressure of oxygen than the incoming air through your ventilation system. So the oxygen is going to diffuse from the alveoli in the lungs into the pulmonary capillaries. Vice versa, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher in the blood than in the air, so the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli, which is then where we exhale it, of course. The partial pressure of oxygen, that's abbreviated PO2, is higher in the blood than in the interstitial fluid when it's entering the systemic capillaries. So oxygen is going to diffuse from the systemic capillaries into the interstitial fluid of the body cells. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is lower in the blood than the interstitial fluid, so vice versa. Carbon dioxide is going to go from those cells, the interstitial fluid of the cells, into the systemic capillaries, up to the pulmonary capillaries, and then ultimately out through the alveoli and our pulmonary ventilation system. Here it is in nice graphic form. You knew your book would have a nice visual for you. Here you can see your alveoli. It's telling you the partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now remember, this is showing us our pulmonary circuit to the lungs coming out of our right ventricle, going over to the lungs. Here's where carbon dioxide is leaving, and here's where oxygen is coming in. Again, it's because there's a difference in partial pressure. If you look here, partial pressure of that deoxygenated blood of oxygen is 40 compared to 105 of that partial pressure in the alveoli. That oxygen is going to go from high to low, so from 105 to 40, it's going to go in to the pulmonary capillaries. Vice versa, a partial pressure of 45 of carbon dioxide and a partial pressure of 40, that carbon dioxide is going to leave our pulmonary circulation and go out through the alveoli, and we exhale it. That oxygenated blood is now going to circulate through the heart, out through the left ventricle, through the aorta, all of our major body arteries, and eventually it's going to get to our systemic capillaries, where you may notice the partial pressure of oxygen in the systemic capillaries is 40, whereas our oxygenated blood has a partial pressure of around 100. So again, that oxygen is going to go out of the blood and into the interstitial fluid. Carbon dioxide is going to leave the interstitial fluid and go into our systemic circuit to the ultimately to the heart, back to the lungs, and so on and so forth. So let's talk about how these gases are transported. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are actually not very soluble in blood. Over 1.5% of body oxygen and 7% of carbon dioxide is dissolved in the blood. So that means the rest of it is transported by protein. So very little of the oxygen and carbon dioxide that's moving in our blood is actually dissolved in the blood. There's usually transport proteins that are carrying those molecules. 98.5% of oxygen is transported on a molecule called hemoglobin. You may recall our discussion of hemoglobin earlier in the chapter on blood. One hemoglobin molecule is going to contain 4 oxygen molecules, and when that oxygen and hemoglobin combine, they form a new molecule called oxyhemoglobin, and that is what gives blood its bright red appearance when it's saturated with oxygen. Carbon dioxide transport, again, as I mentioned, only 7% of it is dissolved. The majority of carbon dioxide is actually converted into an ion called bicarbonate. 23% of it is transported on the hemoglobin, just like the oxygen would be, and that's on a molecule called carbaminohemoglobin, as opposed to the oxyhemoglobin that we mentioned before. 70%, the majority of it, is a bicarbonate ion. So the majority of carbon dioxide in our blood is in fact not even carbon dioxide. An enzyme called carbonic anhydrase combines with water and forms a molecule called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then breaks apart into bicarbonate and hydrogen, and those bicarbonate ions diffuse from the red blood cells into the plasma. The hemoglobin can then pick up extra hydrogen ions to help keep the blood pH stable. So the bicarbonate ions act as a buffer in our blood to help stabilize our blood pH so that it does not become too acidic. The venous blood has less oxygen, so it's more maroon in color. And again, that's because that oxyhemoglobin has that very reddish pigment to it. So let's talk about the pulmonary capillaries. In the pulmonary capillaries, there's a high partial pressure of oxygen, a low partial pressure of carbon dioxide. That's going to cause hemoglobin to bind to oxygen and to release carbon dioxide and hydrogen. The hydrogen is going to recombine with bicarbonate to form that carbonic acid. Carbonic anhydrase is then going to change carbonic acid to water and carbon dioxide, and then that carbon dioxide can diffuse out of the red blood cells into the alveoli where we can exhale it. The low solubility of carbon dioxide is as a protective agent to ensure that it is going to exit from the body. In other words, if it were dissolved in our blood, it would take much more effort for our body to get rid of it. So the bicarbonate transportation of carbon dioxide is a more efficient way to get rid of the molecule. Here you can see this in a complex process. Your book always has very nice diagrams for this. So let's start up here in the external respiration with pulmonary gas exchange. That low oxygenated blood coming from our heart into our pulmonary circulation is going to get rid of carbon dioxide. Here you can see our red blood cell with its bicarbonate ion and carbaminohemoglobin on it. You can see the bicarbonate ion here. 70% in our blood is bicarbonate ion. That carbon dioxide, some of it is just dissolved. All of that is going to go through that reaction that I described using carbonic anhydrase to get converted back into carbon dioxide and water, or that carbon dioxide is released. The oxygen coming in, just a small percentage of it is dissolved. The majority of it is going to be bound to those hemoglobin molecules on the red blood cell. It's going to circulate through. The hemoglobin molecules will release the oxygen into the blood at the tissue level, and then that oxygen can then be absorbed by the interstitial fluid and then eventually into the tissue cells. Vice versa, our tissue cells are going to give off carbon dioxide as a byproduct of respiration. The majority of it, again, is going to be dissolved as the bicarbonate ion. Some of it will be joined to the hemoglobin, and very little of it will be dissolved in the blood. Here it is a little diagram of looking at that dynamic with that carbon dioxide and water and the interaction with hemoglobin. So here you see, we'll look at the beginning. we have the idea of this oxygenated air being inhaled, diffusing across the alveoli into the interstitial fluid, into that pulmonary capillary. Once we're in the pulmonary capillary, that oxygen is going to bind to hemoglobin and form our oxyhemoglobin here. At the tissue level, that oxygen will be released, and so you don't have an oxygen over here. That oxygen is, this diagram's kind of missing that, but the oxygen would be given off at the tissue level. The bicarbonate ion would be absorbed. The bicarbonate ion is going to join with another hydrogen ion to form carbonic acid. That carbonic acid is going to react, that's what this arrow is showing you, with that molecule called carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic anhydrase is going to break down our carbonic acid into water and carbon dioxide. Then that carbon dioxide can dissolve in our blood, be released into the pulmonary capillaries, diffuse into the alveoli, and we can exhale it. This chart down here goes through the same exact thing that I just read to you. So if what I didn't read to you or what I didn't say to you makes sense, then you might want to take some time and look at this chart. This is showing you the opposite effect. Here at our tissue cells, we have, I guess we can, we'll start over here. So we have our oxyhemoglobin here coming from our pulmonary circuit into our systemic circuit. The hemoglobin is going to dissociate from the oxygen. Oxygen is going to then diffuse through the systemic capillary walls into the interstitial fluid into our tissue cells, where it can undergo aerobic respiration to produce the byproduct of carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide is then diffused into the interstitial fluid, into our systemic capillaries. Some of it is going to dissolve in the blood. The majority of it is going to be absorbed by our red blood cell, where some of it will bind to hemoglobin, as you see here, and form that carbaminohemoglobin, as I mentioned. Some of it is going to combine with water in the reaction using carbonic anhydrase to form the carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is going to dissociate very quickly to form a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion. This bicarbonate ion is released into the blood. 70% of carbon dioxide is circulated in our blood as that bicarbonate ion. And you can see here that extra hydrogen. This hydrogen can be used to create that oxyhemoglobin. This hydrogen can recombine with the bicarbonate ion to balance the pH of the blood, depending on what our buffer demands may be. So let's talk about the control of respiration. There's two main areas of our brain that are going to control respiration. The medulla oblongata is the major one, and the pons is another one. The inspiratory area of our brain is located in the medulla oblongata. This is going to control the rate and the depth of breathing. This area is going to send nerve impulses to our diaphragm and external intercostals, which are the muscles used in inhalation, telling them to contract. It's also going to cease those nerve impulses for those muscles to relax and passive exhalation to take place. This is also the expiratory area. The neurons, as I mentioned, they are inactive during quiet breathing. So as you are sitting here maybe listening to my lecture, or maybe you'll pause this and get up and get a drink or something like that, you're still doing quiet breathing. Your inspiratory area is sending impulses, and those kind of breaks in between the impulses would be when your expiring or expiration is occurring, and that, remember, is a passive process. However, when you're breathing harder, your inspiratory area is going to send nerve impulses to more muscles and to expiratory muscles, and that forceful exhalation that sometimes you need to do if you're, for instance, I'm doing it a little bit because I'm talking, and I have to kind of control my breathing a little bit more as I'm lecturing. The pons also has a regulatory area called a pneumotaxic area. This is going to cyclically send inhibitory nerve impulses to that inspiratory area. So it's limiting inhalation and facilitating exhalation. This area is going to shorten inspiration and cause shorter, shallower breaths, such as panting. It also prolongs inhalation to allow those slow, deep breaths, such as during times of vocalization, such as I'm doing now. There's also the apopneustic area of the pons. This is going to send stimulatory impulses to that inspiratory area of the medulla oblongata that's going to help activate and prolong inhalation and inhibit exhalation. Both of these areas are going to influence the inspiratory area to modify the rhythm of your breathing. The cerebral cortex also has influence on the respiratory center. As we looked at when we were talking about the nervous system, basically anything higher up in your brain can control things that are lower down on your brain, and of course the medulla oblongata and the pons are on the brainstem, so you can't get much lower than that. This is going to allow for special voluntary changes in the rate and depth of breathing. In other words, you can make a conscious decision to inhale or exhale deeply, or to increase your rate of breathing, or to hold your breath. And that's all done via your cerebral cortex. But when consciousness is lost, your brainstem is going to oversee the breathing. Your brainstem is going to keep you alive. The pons and medulla oblongata are going to send those inhalation nerve impulses. There can also be a buildup of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions that leads to brainstem action to promote breathing. This is why you can't hold your breath for too long. If I were to, give you the time right now and say, okay, hold your breath for as long as you possibly can, afterwards you would have to exhale, because all of that carbon dioxide and all of those hydrogen ions are building up in your blood, and your chemoreceptors, which are sensing the carbon dioxide and the pH, are firing and telling your medulla oblongata and your pons, help, help, it's getting too concentrated in here, we have to get rid of this carbon dioxide. So nerve impulses from the hypothalamus as well as the limbic system can also stimulate the respiration center, which is why sometimes when you're angry, your breathing rate increases, or when you're sad, or when you're crying, things that deal with your emotions can also impact your breathing. So here you see the diagram of the respiratory center. You can see that your inspiratory area and expiratory area are very close to each other within the medulla oblongata and the pons. Almost in the pons, I should say, for the inspiratory area. Your pneumotaxic apopneustic centers of the pons are ultimately going to relay information through that inspiratory center. Here you can see what all of the various areas do. Your inspiratory area, when it's active, is going to cause your diaphragm and external intercostals to contract during quiet inhalation. When it's inactive, those muscles relax, allowing for quiet exhalation. When your inspiratory area is active, your diaphragm, sternocleidomastoid, scalenes can contract for a forceful inhalation. Your expiratory area can become active during a forceful exhalation, innervating and telling your internal intercostals and abdominal muscles to contract to kind of squeeze that extra air out. As I mentioned, those chemoreceptors are special sensory neurons that are going to be responsive to chemicals. They're found within the medulla oblongata, within the carotid bodies, carotid artery, aortic arch. They're going to have an influence over your respiratory centers as well. As I mentioned, buildup of pH, buildup of carbon dioxide are going to fire those neurons to get them going. There's central chemoreceptors in your medulla oblongata that are going to monitor carbon dioxide and pH levels, as I mentioned. That's especially within the cerebrospinal fluid. The peripheral ones are the ones I was referring to. These are in the carotid bodies of the carotid artery and the aortic arch. They're monitoring blood oxygen, blood carbon dioxide, as well as pH. A decrease in partial pressure of oxygen and pH, in other words, more acidic, and a drop in oxygen levels, or an increase in partial pressure of carbon dioxide, lots of carbon dioxide buildup. That's going to stimulate those chemoreceptors to send nerve impulses to that respiratory center, resulting in an increased breathing rate. If there are increases in the partial pressure of oxygen and pH, or decreases in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, then you're going to decrease your breathing rate. Too much oxygen is not a good thing either. So it's part of a negative feedback loop for regulation of carbon dioxide, oxygen, as well as hydrogen ion levels in the blood. And remember, those hydrogen ion levels are related to pH. There is such thing as severe oxygen deficiency. This would depress the activity of the central chemoreceptor and inspiratory area. Fewer and fewer impulses are going to be sent to respiratory muscles. This can be fatal. There's other factors that govern the rate and depth of breathing. I mentioned the limbic system. This is going to stimulate the respiratory center under perceived emotional stress. So again, with crying or anger or even happiness, surprise, all of those emotions can increase or decrease the rate and depth of breathing. There's also proprioceptor stimulation. Special proprioceptors stimulating the inspiratory area are going to increase the rate and depth of breathing. For instance, if you're doing a handstand and your body senses that gravity is pushing the blood down into your brain, your rate and depth of breathing is going to change at that point. Temperature is also going to have an effect on the rate and depth of breathing. An increase in body temperature is also going to increase the rate and depth of breathing as your body's trying to get rid of all that internal heat to cool itself off. A decrease in body temperature is going to decrease the rate and breath of breathing because you want to keep that warm air inside of you for as long as you can so that you can warm up your body. A sudden cold stimulus can actually slow or temporarily stop breathing, causing apnea, which some of you may have experienced before if you've maybe done the polar bear plunge. Jumping into that cold Chesapeake Bay water can kind of make you catch your breath because it's such a cold shock to your body. There's also pain and the inflation reflex. Pain, such as an intense acute pain, inducing an apnea, and chronic pain can actually increase the breathing rate. A visceral pain can slow the breathing rate, right? Think about if you're having a tummy ache or cramps, you're going to kind of slow your breathing rate, maybe hold your breath a little bit till that cramp passes. The inflation reflex is actually when special stretch receptors in your bronchi and bronchioles inhibit the inspiratory area and initiate exhalation. This reflex is actually protective for preventing excessive inflation of the lungs. So in other words, your lungs can only inflate so much before this inflation reflex kicks in, and your body will not allow you to inhale anymore. This is showing you that negative feedback loop for the rate and depth of breathing. You have your central chemoreceptors in your medulla, monitoring pH, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, as well as the cerebrospinal fluid, giving that information back to the peripheral chemoreceptors within the carotid bodies, monitoring pH, oxygen, as well as carbon dioxide of the blood, giving that feedback information up to our respiratory centers. So again, all of this information is controlled and relayed through our inspiratory centers. Here you can see a nice little cartoon diagram. You have some type of stimulus disrupting homeostasis, arterial blood, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or a decreasing pH, more acidic pH, or decreasing partial pressure of oxygen. Either way, it's going to activate our central chemoreceptors and our peripheral chemoreceptors in the aortic and carotid bodies. That's going to send nerve impulses to our inspiratory area of our medulla oblongata. That's going to send motor impulses down to our muscles for inhalation to get us to inhale more, bring more oxygen into our body. That's going to bring in a decrease of arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide, an increase of pH, an increase of partial pressure of oxygen, ultimately to get us back to homeostasis where everything's back to normal. Hiccups are just an extra impulse from the respiratory center. It asynchronously stimulates our respiratory muscles, which is why a hiccup doesn't cause a very coordinated inhalation. It's kind of a disjointed muscle contraction of your diaphragm that occurs, which is why you kind of look a little silly when you do it sometimes. So why is good respiratory health important? Respiratory system oxygenates our cells and our tissues. This is going to help allow for proper functioning of all of our tissues, aid with ATP production, which of course we know is our cell's energy source. This is also going to allow for the ability to perform strenuous activity. Strenuous is a relative term. This could be something as simple as walking up the stairs, or this could be something like weightlifting or running a marathon. Either way, you need a good respiratory system in place for those types of activities. So speaking of running a marathon, let's talk about the impact of exercise on respiration. When you initiate your exercise, there's special proprioceptors in your muscles and joints that are going to stimulate the respiratory center within your brain, increasing the rate and depth of breathing. If you've been someone who goes to the gym regularly, you kind of almost feel that rhythm set in when you hop on the treadmill or the elliptical machine. You get into this rhythm of a rate and depth of breath that you feel comfortable. And that's because your respiratory center in your brain says, oh, I know what we're doing. I'm used to this 3-mile run, or, the 6.0 on the, elliptical, or whatever you're doing. Your body gets into that pace. Ultimately, ATP is needed, right, for muscle activity. To generate that ATP, the cells are going to use that oxygen. They're going to generate lots of carbon dioxide, and with it, lots of hydrogen ions are going to be created because of that bicarbonate transport of carbon dioxide. So when the partial pressures of these respiratory gases change, your peripheral chemoreceptors are going to trigger your respiratory centers to increase the rate and depth of breathing. In other words, if your oxygen level decreases too much or your carbon dioxide level increases too much, your body's going to increase the rate and depth of breathing. You're going to start breathing heavier, and quicker. Oxygenation of blood and the removal of carbon dioxide has to be accomplished in order for your body to maintain homeostasis. Blood levels of respiratory gases need to stay at normal levels in order for your body to function appropriately, even if you're exercising. So this diagram here goes through the impacts of exercise. Your metabolism of muscles are going to produce lots of carbon dioxide, increasing partial pressure of carbon dioxide, consuming lots of oxygen, decreasing partial pressure of oxygen, releasing hydrogen, decreasing our blood pH, becoming more acidic. That's going to stimulate our peripheral chemoreceptors, sending that information up to our central chemoreceptors and our inspiratory center, which is then going to increase the rate and depth of breathing, and external respiration is going to increase as well. So lastly, let's always talk about aging and how aging impacts this body system of our respiratory system. Airways, elastic, and respiratory tissues are going to become more rigid and less elastic. And that's just because of the natural breakdown of all of our connective tissues over time. The chest wall becomes less pliable. There's a decreased lung capacity because of that loss of flexibility. Your vital capacity could actually decrease up to 35% by age 70. Alveolar macrophage activities and ciliary action with the respiratory tract is decreased. Again, just because of the slowing of metabolism at all levels. So that's going to lead to a higher susceptibility of disease. Your blood oxygen levels decrease as your cells become less efficient at diffusing. Let's talk about some diseases in respiration. There's bronchitis, pneumonia, emphysema. These three disorders are going to restrict airflow, like obstructive pulmonary diseases. They can decrease lung volumes and capacities, which would be restrictive pulmonary diseases, or they can decrease diffusion rates across the membranes. There's also pulmonary infections that destroy alveolar membranes, causing airway inflammation, mucus accumulation, and even alveolar damage. Pulmonary edema is another condition. This is the buildup of fluid in the interstitial spaces and alveoli. This can occur when the pulmonary capillary membrane is broken down from disease, infection, or a condition like congenital heart failure. This is caused by an increase in filtration. So the fluid buildup is going to prevent diffusion because the excess fluid itself becomes a physical barrier. The gases just can't get through that extra fluid. So the oxygen during inhalation is not going to fuse as quickly or as well through that extra fluid, and it won't be picked up by the hemoglobin. It's actually breathed out before it's even used. That excess fluid is also going to reduce the lung flexibility to decrease pulmonary ventilation. Let's talk about some effects of smoking. We all know it's bad, but let's talk about some specifics here. Smoking is going to irritate the airways and linings. It's going to lead to inflammation and obstructive diseases. Cigarette smoke, of course, contains carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is actually going to displace oxygen on the hemoglobin molecule. So hemoglobin actually has a higher binding affinity for carbon monoxide than it does for oxygen. So ultimately, that's going to reduce the amount of oxygen that's transported throughout your body, which is why your body is kind of suffocating itself as it breathes in that carbon monoxide. Of course, we all know that there's chemicals in cigarette smoke. This is going to paralyze the cilia of the trachea, allow contaminants to get into the alveoli, making our lung tissues less elastic, leading to emphysema, stimulate uncontrolled cell growth, which can lead to lung cancer. Lung cancer is actually the #1 cause of cancer death in the United States. This diagram here goes to the combined effects of aging and cigarette smoking. Aging, as we said, those airways and tissues are going to become more rigid, ciliary action is going to become decreased, chest wall is less pliable, and there's a decrease in blood oxygen levels. Smoking pretty much does the same thing. Linings and airways are irritated, stimulating uncontrolled cell growth, destroying the alveoli, and then, of course, becoming less efficient at transporting blood oxygen because of that carbon monoxide instead of the oxygen binding to the hemoglobin. And that ends chapter 13.